All right, welcome back, everyone. We're going to now move on to the question and answer portion of our agenda. So through registration and during the presentation portion of the meeting today, participants had the opportunity to submit questions for BOEM subject matter experts to consider and answer. So now we're going to take some time to hear BOEM's responses to your questions. And the first batch of questions is going to be answered by Courtney Strain. So Courtney, if you could just introduce yourself once more for everybody, and then I can share the questions that we received.
Sure, thanks, Hannah. Hello, everyone. My name is Courtney Strain, and I am an oceanographer in BOEM's Office of Environmental Programs, and I'm serving as the project manager for the New York Bight Programmatic Environmental Impact Statement.
Great, thanks, Courtney. So the first question that we had is how to insist that independent scientists conduct a pilot scale project.
Thanks, Hannah, and thanks for this input, Susan. So BOEM conducts research on the impacts of all of our activities, including offshore wind. We employ hundreds of scientists and work with other federal agencies, as well as external scientists and researchers. BOEM has conducted research in preparation for offshore wind development and alongside that development to ensure that we understand and adequately monitor for environmental impacts. And in terms of pilot projects, there are currently 2 projects that have been installed off the US coast. One is a 5-turbine pilot project called the Block Island Wind Farm, which was permitted by the US Army Corps of Engineers and is located about 3 miles offshore Block Island, Rhode Island. And the other is a 2-turbine research pilot project called the Coastal Virginia Offshore Wind, or CVOW project, that BOEM permitted, and it is located about 27 miles offshore Virginia Beach, Virginia. And through BOEM's real-time opportunity for development environmental observations, or RODEO study, we are learning and gathering information during construction and operations of offshore wind facilities. For example, at CVOW, measurements were taken during the installation of 2 monopile turbines. One was installed using a bubble curtain to reduce the sound, while the other was not. Comparing results demonstrated that the bubble curtain reduced the sound significantly and supports the requirement for using bubble curtains as a mitigation measure. The reports from these efforts can be found on BOEM's website, and we will post that link in the chat for you all.
Great, thank you, Courtney. The next question we have is, why are we required to ask questions prior to the meeting before having the opportunity to see the presentation?
Sure, thanks for the question. So the registration form for this meeting had a space to input initial questions. Attendees could also ask questions using the Q&A function during the opening remarks, the presentations, in the beginning of the comment portion of the meeting today. We certainly appreciate all of the great questions we've received and are glad you all stayed on the line to hear our responses.
Thank you. The next question is, what consequences of delaying comment period? Delaying the comment period.
Sure. Thanks for the question and for participating in today's meeting. So BOEM is required to provide a minimum of 45 days for public review of and comment on a draft EIS, or environmental impact statement. The public comment period will close February 26, 2024. Currently, BOEM does not anticipate a comment period extension. However, we review and consider all requests for extensions when received. We expect that the final programmatic EIS will be published in October of this year. And part of the reason why we are preparing this programmatic EIS is to help streamline the subsequent environmental reviews. The PEIS will provide content that can be incorporated into the environmental analyses at the construction operations plan stage for the 6 New York Bight leases.
Great, thank you. And our next question is, what advantage is there to putting wind farms in the ocean rather than on high ground inland?
Sure, thanks for the question. So as with all resource development activities, there are advantages and disadvantages. And this is also true for wind and other renewable energy development, both on land and in the ocean. BOEM's responsibility is to analyze the potential impacts of energy development activities within its jurisdiction, which is the Outer Continental Shelf, or OCS. The New York Bight Programmatic EIS is a first step in the analyses of the potential environmental impacts of offshore wind energy facilities in 6 lease areas specifically located in the New York Bight region.
Great, thanks so much, Courtney.
Sure.
The next question is going to be answered by John McCarty. So John, if you want to introduce yourself, I can then hand you the question.
Hi, yes, thank you. I'm John McCarty. I'm a landscape architect within the Office of Renewable Energy Programs at BOEM. My specialty is in visual impact assessment.
Great, thanks, John. So the question we have is, how will BOEM assess and mitigate visual impacts?
Yes, thank you, Ms. Rafferty, for your question. BOEM guidance for assessing visual impacts is titled Assessment of Seascape, Landscape, and Visual Impacts of Offshore Wind Energy Developments on the Outer Continental Shelf of the United States. Now that's a long title, and we've reduced that down to a short acronym of SLVIA, or otherwise affectionately referred to as Sylvia. So I'll refer to that as we move forward here. BOEM followed this guidance in the assessing of visual impacts for the New York Bight Programmatic EIS. The process entails establishing a geographic analysis area using GIS, produced affected viewshed mapping based on 2 different dimension scenarios of wind turbine generators. The first at 853 feet tall, which is what's currently commercially available today. And then 1,312 foot tall wind turbine, which is a speculative possibility of what may be available sometime in the future based on current trends in the evolution of wind turbine designs. The EIS needed life over a period of years, and so we look at what's available today in the wind turbine dimensions, and then what potentially may be available in the future to create this range of impact evaluations. In addition, in a visual impact assessment, we look at the inventory. We do an inventory of coastal seascape and landscape character within the geographic analysis area. We identify key observation points, which are locations where people congregate, where the ocean views play a role in those experiences and why they go to these places. At these key observation points, we take photography and we produce photo simulations. Then we assess the impact to the scenic physical attributes of seascape and landscape and ocean character areas that are products of that inventory I just mentioned, and then impacts to the viewer experiences at the key observation points. Cumulative effect simulations were also produced, and analysis of impacts from foreseeable planned actions was also prepared. Details on these methods are described in the Sylvia guiding document that I mentioned earlier. And when I get done responding to your question, I will put that link in the chat. The visual impact is in 2 locations, which include the draft Programmatic EIS, Volume 1, Chapter 3, Section 3.6.9, and then Volume 2, Appendix H, Seascape, Landscape, and Visual Impact Assessment. The Volume 2, Appendix H, that's the detailed analysis with lots of tables and explanations and evaluations of impact. And Chapter 3 is the summary of the findings in Appendix H. I will also put a link where Volume 1 may be downloaded in the chat, and then also a link for where you can go directly to Appendix H, download from there, and then also on that same page where the appendix is a list of the photo simulations that you can either link on and view online or also download and view from your own computer and from your own hard drive. When you go to that site for the Appendix H, it'll be a general page, and you go up to the top, and there are several tabs across the top, and the third from the left is labeled Visual Impact Assessment. That's where you want to go download from. Now, regarding your question on mitigation, generally mitigating visual impacts is accomplished by reducing visual contrast between the proposed action and the setting where the project site is located. Reducing visual contrast is accomplished through design adjustments to the project's facilities in form, line, color, and texture. And we can accomplish that well on shore. It's a little bit more difficult offshore. So as a result, mitigating impacts by offshore energy features such as wind turbines are pretty much limited to the possibility of reducing the height of the wind turbines, which again is kind of restricted by what's available in the industry, and also adjusting the distance between the viewer and the wind turbines, which is restricted to within a lease area. We do have some COPs and EISs for those leases that both those strategies have been used at looking at alternatives to reduce visual impact. Now, mitigating nighttime visual impacts by offshore facilities may be accomplished through deployment of the aviation detection lighting systems, or otherwise known as ADLS, that keep aviation warning lights in the off position until low-flying aircraft enter the collision risk area, at which time the aviation lights are then triggered to the on position until the aircraft leaves the danger zone. Now, a little bit on onshore facilities. Visual impact by onshore facilities that are connected to the offshore wind energy projects may be mitigated through those adjusting of visual elements of form, line, color, and texture, reducing those visual contrasting elements by strategic siting of facilities, screening, leaving vegetation in place or planting additional vegetation, color treatments to facilities that blend in with the background as opposed to contrasting with the background, and other design measures.
Great. Thanks so much, John.
I'll post those links as you move on to your next series of questions and answers. Thanks.
Great, really appreciate it. Thank you, John. Okay, I'm going to turn it back to Courtney to answer the next few questions. Okay, our next question is, are the cumulative effects of all the Eastern Seaboard wind projects taken into consideration?
Sure. Hi, everyone. I'm Courtney Strain. If you missed my first introduction, I'm an oceanographer in BOEM's Office of Environmental Programs and serving as the project manager on the New York Bight Programmatic EIS. So this question was about the cumulative effects of all Eastern Seaboard wind projects. Just to recap, so in short, yes, they are taken into consideration. The cumulative impacts analysis in this draft programmatic EIS considers all other ongoing and planned offshore wind activities. So ongoing offshore wind activities for the cumulative impact analysis does not include any of the 6 New York Bight leases, but it does include all others that are currently either under construction, in operation, or they have an approved construction operation plan, or COP, as of November of 2023, whereas planned offshore wind activities include other reasonably foreseeable future offshore wind activities other than the 6 New York Bight projects. And that is projects that have an executed lease, but for which there is not an approved construction operation plan yet at the time of the publication of this draft programmatic EIS.
Great, thanks, Courtney. The next question we have is, how will the avoidance and mitigation measures proposed be coordinated with regional science plans and priorities like the RWSC?
Thanks for the question. So BOEM, along with other federal scientists, lessees, NGOs, and academic institutions, participate on various ways with the Regional Wildlife Science Collaborative, or RWSC. And BOEM will consider findings from the RWSC and other sources in determining the appropriate mitigation measures for specific projects and in BOEM's environmental studies program.
Thank you. The next question is, I would like to learn more about how individual projects will tier to the PEIF.
Thanks for the question. So one of the objectives for this programmatic EIS is to support tiering of project-specific environmental analyses. The programmatic EIS includes the analysis upon which the COP-specific NEPA analysis can build, and it also details for each resource whether the programmatic analysis may need to be refined at the COP-specific NEPA stage. So generally, if a COP proposes activities that are captured by the programmatic EIS design envelope, then the COP-specific NEPA will focus on what is different or site-specific analysis that could not be conducted in the programmatic EIS. So for example, since details of onshore components are not known at this time, detailed site-specific analyses of these components will be deferred and evaluated at the COP-specific stage for all of the 6 New York Bight lease areas. Appendix C of the draft programmatic EIS may also be a good resource for additional information, as it provides guidance for each resource on how the programmatic analysis may need to be refined at the COP-specific NEPA stage. And we will add a direct link to Appendix C in the chat.
Great, thank you. I see that that link was added. That's great. Okay, our next question is, overall, what amount of environmental damage and marine species loss will occur from the New York Bight offshore wind project?
So the draft programmatic EIS analyzes potential impacts from a representative project that could occur in any of the 6 New York Bight lease areas. The analysis considers the maximum case scenario, or in other words, the most impactful scenario to capture the most conservative range of potential impacts if any one project were to be developed. The draft PEIS uses a 4-level classification scheme to characterize the potential beneficial impacts and adverse impacts of alternatives, and those are negligible, minor, moderate, or major. And for many resource areas, the draft programmatic EIS describes potential impacts from all 6 representative projects to be negligible to moderate. However, for a few resources, the analysis acknowledges that the potential for up to major impacts. These include impacts to marine mammals, finfish, invertebrates, and essential fish habitat, scenic and visual resources, cultural resources, fisheries, and the scientific research and surveys component of the other uses resource. Potential beneficial impacts were also identified for several resources. And the impacts analysis in the draft programmatic EIS typically resulted in a range, such as from negligible to moderate, due to the large range in the representative project design envelope that was analyzed. The environmental review that's completed at the construction and operations plan phase, or COP phase, will analyze the details of each specific lease area and proposed project, and will provide a more refined impacts analysis. Additionally, consultations under the Marine Mammal Protection Act and the Endangered Species Act will be completed once COPs are received, which will identify specific potential impacts to marine and avian species.
Thanks, Courtney. Our next question is, in the PIS Table G, it states that there will be monitoring that must be completed prior to construction. What happens if the monitoring is disrupted due to anomalies like El Nino, hurricane, flooding, oil spills, etc.? Will the monitoring be continued, and will construction be delayed until baseline data is complete?
So thanks for this question. There are many types of monitoring required prior to and throughout the phases of offshore wind planning and development. In addition, there's a substantial amount of ecological, oceanographic, and human use information for the areas in the Atlantic where the New York Bight leases are located. If a monitoring effort were disrupted in some way, BOEM would assess what data were already available, what was lost as a result of this disruption, as well as the implications of that disruption in the monitoring to the overall project and associated requirements before determining next steps. And regarding the disruption of funding, project construction costs and overruns are outside BOEM's control. However, lessees are required to post financial assurance to cover the decommissioning or removal of project infrastructure, and that includes wind turbine generators, offshore substations, and cables. This financial assurance is most often provided in the form of a bond or a letter of credit.
Great. Okay. Our next question is, when will a formal EIS be available for viewing, and will there be meetings upon the final EIS for public comment?
So the draft programmatic EIS is currently available to review and comment on. We will post the link to the document in the chat, and we are accepting comments through February 26th. We anticipate that the final programmatic EIS will be available in October of this year. There will not be additional public meetings for the final PEIS, but there will be project-specific meetings in the future as NEPA analyses for the construction and operation plans are conducted.
Thank you. The next question is, some AMMs indicate that multiple agencies are responsible for their enforcement, but do not indicate whether one takes the lead and which one if so. Will this information be made available in the final PEIS?
Well, thank you for your question. The requested information will not be included in the final PEIS, and that is because BOEM does not indicate which agencies have the lead, as each agency identified may have responsibilities under their respective authorities or regulations. The exception here, however, is BOEM and the Bureau of Safety and Environmental Enforcement, or BSEE, as roles for each agency are identified in a recent rulemaking.
Courtney. Okay, and our next question is, how are the findings of the synthesis of science report, quote, major gaps in knowledge, end quote, taken into consideration for the current environmental impact statements?
Thank you for your comment. So BOEM uses best available science to understand the potential impacts to living marine resources and benthic habitats from proposed projects. It is important for federal regulators and fisheries stakeholders to have a common scientific understanding of the environment. The 2020 workshop allowed BOEM, ROTA, and NOAA Fisheries to share common scientific information to help identify research needs. And this report was co-produced by members from the fishing communities to provide their perspective on the current understanding of offshore wind interactions with the environment and in the identification of data gaps. There have been several studies concluded and initiated since that workshop to help address information needs. The results of these studies are incorporated into BOEM's environmental analyses, such as this programmatic draft programmatic EIS.
Great, thanks. The next question asks, can you talk a little bit about why BOEM included voluntary AMMM measures in Appendix G that have not been included in COPS previously? And how would these mitigation measures apply?
Thanks for the question. So this draft programmatic EIS provided an opportunity for BOEM to analyze how additional or new AM measures could reduce potential impacts. In many cases, these new AM measures were suggested through the programmatic EIS scoping process or through input from cooperating agencies or BOEM subject matter experts. Some of these more novel measures are identified as voluntary because they are more of a best management practice or need more detailed information to be applied. And the application of these mitigation measures may be revisited at the COP NEPA stage, and if selected, additional detail would be incorporated as appropriate into the COP terms and conditions. And BOEM included these AM measures that have been previously included as COP terms and conditions to support streamlining of that analysis at the COP-specific NEPA stage.
Thanks so much, Courtney. Appreciate your answers.
Thank you.
I'm now going to go to Gwen Gallagher for the next question. So Gwen, if you just want to introduce yourself, and then I can read out the question.
Hi, everyone. My name is Gwen Gallagher, and I am a biologist within the Office of Environmental Programs at BOEM. I'm going to answer the question we received related to the leasing through decommissioning process.
Thanks, Gwen. So the question is, when turbines are either decommissioned or are damaged beyond repair, as well as when the lease has expired, will they be replaced with new turbines and/or a renewed lease?
Thanks, Hannah. Each of the 6 approved leases in the New York Bight has an operations term of 33 years that would commence on the date of the construction and operation plan approval. After those 33 years, the lease would expire or terminate. For the programmatic EIS analysis, BOEM assumes that each of the New York Bight projects would have an operating period of 35 years. We did this to avoid the possibility of underestimating any potential effects. Federal regulations require that the lessee must decommission the facility within 2 years following the termination or expiration of the lease. A lessee may request a renewal of the operation terms, and BOEM, at its discretion, may approve a renewal request to conduct similar activities as originally authorized. BOEM considers the following criteria when thinking about whether to renew a lease. One is the design life of the existing technology. The second consideration is the availability and feasibility of the new technology, if new technology is being proposed. The third is the environmental and safety record of the lessee. The fourth consideration is the operation and financial compliance record of the lessee. The fifth consideration is competitive interest and fair return considerations. And the sixth is the effects of the lease on generation capacity and reliability within the regional electrical distribution and transmission system. Overall, any renewal request would be subject to environmental and technical reviews to assess if the existing environmental compliance is sufficient or if new analyses are needed.
Thanks so much, Gwen. Appreciate the answer. Now the next few questions, I'm going to hand over to Ian Slayton. So if Ian, you want to introduce yourself, and then I can read out the next few questions. Over to you, Ian.
Hello, my name is Ian Slayton. I'm a program analyst in the Office of Renewable Energy Programs.
Great, thanks. Okay, our first question here is, can you please provide clear and definitive on and offshore emissions predictions for survey and interconnection construction services?
Sure. So emissions associated with survey activities were considered in the 2021 New York Bight Environmental Assessment that considered impacts from issuing leases in the New York Bight. And a link to that document is being shared in the chat. Oh, there it is. An estimate of total emissions from a single project during construction is given on page 3.4.1-13 of the New York Bight Draft Programmatic Environmental Impact Statement, so the document we're talking about today, and an estimate for total annual emissions from a single project during the operations and maintenance period is given on page 3.4.1-15 of that document. And it's difficult to give an estimate specific to onshore emissions without a specific project proposal. It would vary greatly depending on the number of cables, whether they're connecting to an existing interconnection point or building a new one, or something in between where they're adding to an existing one, and where it's located in terms of how far onshore. The purpose of this draft PEIS is to consider the level of potential impacts to the development of potential impacts due to the development of 6 leases in the New York Bight, and the change in those impacts from potential avoidance, minimization, mitigation, and monitoring measures. That's the AMMM that was mentioned earlier. I don't know if we told you what that said. Somebody asked about it. That could be adopted for the specific project proposals. Each project will have a project-specific consideration prior to any decision, and each project is subject to Clean Air Act permitting requirements.
Great, thank you, Ian. The next question is, how many GHG greenhouse gas will be eliminated after these projects go online?
Thank you for the question. A conservative approach to answering this question is comparing the greenhouse gas emissions from electricity produced by the existing grid mix from all sources, and then considering these the potential avoided emissions for the same amount of electricity that would be produced by offshore wind in megawatt hours, and then subtract from that construction emissions and emissions from operations and maintenance. And so without a specific proposal, it's difficult to provide a figure, but one can expect to avoid greenhouse gas emissions relative to the existing grid in the low millions of metric tons annually per project, after factoring in construction and operations and maintenance activities. And a good example of this can be found in the recent Empire Wind final environmental impact statement on page 3.4-19 in Appendix G. And a link to that is going to be shared in the chat as well. And I would expect projects proposed in these 6 leases to be similar to that, with the caveat that as you have more clean energy facilities come online and the grid mix itself becomes cleaner in the future, there would then be less emissions to offset in that future on a per project basis than there is today.
Thanks, Ian. Okay, the next question looks like it might have been cut off a little strangely, so I'll read it out, but I know we're gonna try our best to answer it. It says, what is a windmill carbon footprint from? And then it got cut off.
Yeah, I think the question was partly lost in transmission, but I'm gonna try to anticipate the direction it was going in here. So if the question was, what is a windmill carbon footprint from? We look at emissions related to constructing, operating, and maintaining the windmills, and assume decommissioning will be equal to the emissions from construction at the end of the project. So essentially, the construction emissions are counted twice in the overall carbon footprint. And in case the question was wanting to ask about materials in the offshore wind farm components in terms of their carbon footprint, a broader perspective on carbon footprints, more remote to a specific proposed action, considers the life cycle emissions of an electricity generating technology, which would include the greenhouse gas emissions related to the materials used, as well from mining and refining to manufacturing and fuel if applicable. Offshore wind has among the lowest life cycle emissions of any generating technology, according to a study by the National Renewable Energy Laboratory that we will link in the chat here that harmonizes life cycle assessments.
Great, thank you for tackling that. Okay, the next question is, what are the inputs in the model for the life cycle analysis of the carbon footprint of wind turbines? Is raw material extraction included, and what generation capacity is assumed?
So it was great having these questions back to back. I answered one and then the other one came in and it was just fate. A life cycle is considered to be cradle to the grave, meaning it begins at the point of the extraction of raw materials and ends at decommissioning. The harmonization of life cycle assessments that we just shared in the previous response, it combines several assessments. So a range of turbine capacities are considered across separate studies that are then part of that harmonized comparison to other generating technologies.
Thank you. Okay, and then our next question is, has BOEM done research on or considered potential impacts on coastal microclimates from large offshore wind farms? Thank you.
Thank you for the question. Yes, BOEM has considered microclimates in the context of offshore wind, and we will share a short white paper on the topic in the chat here. While some localized effects are possible offshore on rare occasions, they're negligible onshore into the overall environment within the context of natural variability. And there's a good amount of discussion in that short paper about the various microclimate effects we were looking at.
Great, thank you so much, Ian, for helping answer these questions. Appreciate it. The next question is going to be taken by David Bigger. So David, we'll spotlight you, and then if you want to just give a little intro, and then I can read out the question.
Yeah, good afternoon, everybody. I'm David Bigger. I'm with BOEM in the Office of Renewable Energy Programs in the Environmental Review Branch. I am a environmental protection specialist. I specialize on a lot of avian and bat issues. And you didn't read the question yet, right? So
yeah.
Okay, good.
Perfect. So the question is, what compensatory mitigation plans do you have for incidental impacts to bird populations from the planned turbine build out?
Okay. Well, thank you for the question. Compensatory mitigation offsets the remaining unavoidable impacts after all appropriate and practicable avoidance and minimization measures have been applied, by replacing or providing substitute resources or environments. And compensatory mitigation aims to restore and enhance or create equivalent ecological value elsewhere. So BOEM is working very closely with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service in developing a process for compensatory mitigation. And there are various compensatory mitigation strategies being discussed, including in-lieu fee programs, mitigation banks, credit exchanges, and additional measures. Thanks again for your question.
Thanks, David. Okay, the next set of questions are going to be answered by Jerry Wisman. Jerry, if you want to introduce yourself, and then I can take us through the questions.
Hi, thanks, Hannah. Hi all, I'm Jerry Wisman. I work with BOEM as a marine mammal and sea turtle subject matter expert in our Office of Renewable Energy Programs.
Thanks, Jerry. The first question is, what criteria is used to authorize incidental takes in regards to the MMPA, ESA, and MSA?
Yeah, thank you for your question. So some background for folks who may not know, and like you noted in your question, take of a marine mammal is not determined through the National Environmental Policy Act, or NEPA, process, but through the Marine Mammal Protection Act, or the MMPA, and or the Endangered Species Act, or the ESA consultation. So for clarity, BOEM does not authorize any permits or takes. Only the National Marine Fisheries Service, or NMFS, has the authority through the MMPA or ESA. Given the nature of this programmatic document, lessees covered will not submit an application under the MMPA to NMFS for an incidental take regulation until they are at construction, operation, and or decommissioning permitting phase of their individual wind projects. The MMPA and ESA require that incidental take documents are prepared to estimate the potential for harassment and or harm resulting from offshore wind development prior to any activities being conducted. Types of incidental taking include level B harassment. So for example, behavioral disturbance, level A harassment, for example, non-serious injury, and or serious injury or mortality.
Thank you. The next question is, are there required mitigation actions required during offshore wind pile driving / construction regarding marine mammals?
Yeah, thank you again for your question. So Appendix G, titled Mitigation and Monitoring of the New York Bight Programmatic DEIS, includes a large table of the programmatic avoidance, minimization, mitigation, and monitoring, or AMMs, as many people have mentioned. And these measures are related to potential offshore wind pile driving and construction-related noise impacts on marine mammals. We have indicated in the table which measures have been included in previous authorizations. However, any mitigation measures will not be required until there is an authorization. In other words, COP approval.
Thanks, Jerry. Okay. Next question is, where is the proof the surveying, seismic blasting, etc., causes no harms to whales, porpoises, I think, and marine life?
Yeah, great question. So regarding the recent deaths of marine mammals and the geophysical surveys conducted by offshore wind developers being cited as the cause of these unfortunate deaths, the Marine Mammal Commission, who is an independent federal agency, their sole purpose is the protection of marine mammals. They have stated, quote, despite several reports in the media, there is no evidence to link these strandings to offshore wind energy development. And for more information on offshore energy development in Wales, please see this fact sheet produced by the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management. I believe someone will drop that link in the chat. And to date, no whale mortality has been attributed to offshore wind activities. Since January of 2016, NOAA Fisheries has monitored unusual mortality events, or UMEs, for humpback whales with elevated strandings along the entire East Coast. This UME began prior to any offshore wind activities in the Atlantic Ocean and corresponds to an increase in the humpback whale populations on the Atlantic that led to the removing them from the endangered species list in 2016. And I believe we're also going to drop the link for the Commission's letter from the Marine Mammal Commission's letter in the chat.
Yes, we will do that for you.
Thank you.
Great. The next question is, would you consider taking the time to address all of the potential impacts on migratory marine mammals?
Yeah, thank you for your question. The potential impacts of the New York Bight Programmatic DEIS's alternatives on marine mammals are assessed in section 3.5.6 of the document. These will be reassessed at each of the project-specific phases for the National Environmental Policy Act. And I'd like to encourage you or anyone else to please submit a public comment if there is important information you feel was not addressed or included in this draft DEIS.
Great. Thanks, Jerry. The next question is, were baseline studies on humpback whale populations in the New York Bight conducted? And if not, how can EI be measured?
Yeah, so humpback whales were assessed and discussed in also in section 3.5.6 of the programmatic draft EIS, and relevant available studies at the time were included in the description and impact analyses sections. These will also be reassessed at each of the project-specific phases for the National Environmental Policy Act process. At this time, the humpback whale population that occurs in the western North Atlantic is not listed under the Endangered Species Act, but it is still considered through the Marine Mammal Protection Act permitting process, which is conducted by the National Marine Fisheries Service, and that's done at the project-specific phase. So information like stock assessments and relevant available science are also included in these processes. On top of that, there have been several studies conducted by both state and federal agencies to assess how various species, including marine mammals, use the New York bite. And there will be a few examples put into the chat as well that you can look at. And again, would like to encourage you or anyone else to please leave a public comment if there's important information or a baseline study that that you feel was not addressed or included in the draft EIS.
Great, thank you. The next question is, please comment on the accusations that the wind farm to shore electrical cables will kill whales, dolphins, and fish.
Yeah, thank you for allowing me to comment on the issue. Again, I would like to, for more detailed information, I'd encourage folks to visit section 3.5.6 of the programmatic draft EIS for analysis of each of the expected impact producing factors impacts on marine mammals. Specific to your question about the impacts from cables, BOEM notes that cable electric and magnetic fields, or EMF for short, effects on marine mammals from ongoing and planned offshore wind projects vary in extent and magnitude depending on the overall cable length, the proportion of buried versus exposed cable segments, and project-specific transmission design. However, measurable EMF effects are generally limited to within tens of feet of cable corridors. Cables would have an appropriate shielding and would be buried or covered, which would also minimize potential EMF effects from cable operation. So given this, BOEM determined for all project alternatives in the DAS that EMF and heat from cables is anticipated to be of the lowest level of detection and barely measurable with no perceptible consequences to individuals or the populations for marine mammals.
Thank you. And then I think last question for you, Jerry, is how is it that the cumulative environmental impacts for marine mammals, alternatives A and B, both the same?
Yeah, thank you for your question. Under the no action alternative or alternative A, existing environmental trends and ongoing activities would continue in addition to impacts from other ongoing and planned wind activities. Marine mammals would continue to be affected by natural and human-caused impact producing factors such as fishing and shipping. Even though the projects included in the programmatic DEIS would not be included under the no action alternative, all other ongoing and planned wind and non-wind activities are still included in the analysis and have varying degrees of anticipated impacts. And in context of other reasonably foreseeable environmental trends, incremental impacts contributed by the 6 New York Bight projects to the cumulative impacts on marine mammals would range from undetectable to noticeable and appreciable. 6 New York Bight projects would contribute to the cumulative impacts primarily through construction noise, vessel traffic, and the presence of structures as related to secondary entanglement and derelict fishing gear.
Thanks so much, Jerry. Yeah, appreciate your help with all these questions. Okay, the next question is going to be answered by Stan Levitt. Stan, if you want to come off mute and give a little intro, and then I can read out the question.
Sure. Hi, I'm Stan Lebach. I'm underwater acoustician here for BOEM's Center for Marine Acoustics.
Thanks, Dan. And the question is, what are recovery times from sonic testing events individually and collectively?
Yes, thank you for the question. It was a little difficult to answer because I'm not sure exactly what you're asking, but by sonic testing, I assume that you mean the high resolution geophysical or HRG surveys being conducted offshore during the site assessments for these projects. In general, these sonar systems, which include side scan sonars and sub bottom profilers and others, have a very small or negligible chance of impacting the animals due to both the way the systems operate, their characteristics, which includes their frequency, source level, beam patterns, and other factors, and also the mitigation measures that are in place during their operation. Experimental measurements on marine mammals have shown that recovery times for signals much louder than these systems have been measured in terms of seconds or up to several minutes. But these are for louder and stronger signals and longer duration signals than are typically used by these systems. Acoustic thresholds also are used to indicate the thresholds of both. They use both peak levels and energy levels to look at the individual transmissions and then all the energy accumulative in multiple transmissions collectively. And those are part of the thresholds that are looked at and examined during an analysis of these systems.
Thanks, Dan. Appreciate it. Okay, the next few questions are going to be answered by Brandon Jensen. So Brandon, we'll spotlight you, and if you don't mind giving an introduction, and then I'll lead us through these questions.
Sure thing. Hey, everyone. Good afternoon. Thanks for sticking out this period with us. It's a long one, but happy to answer some questions. I'm Brandon Jensen, fisheries biologist with the Office of Renewable Energy Programs, environmental branch for renewable energy, subject matter expert for benthic ecology and central fish habitat and fisheries.
Thanks, Brandon. So the first question we have is, why risk the marine life for this unreliable energy production when we have more efficient ways to produce energy?
Yeah, thanks for your comment. Congress gave BOEM the authority to regulate offshore renewable energy through the Energy Policy Act. BOEM takes seriously its role to avoid, minimize, and if necessary, mitigate potential impacts from activities that it authorizes. The programmatic draft EIS includes an extensive analysis of marine life, including fish, invertebrates, essential fish habitat, and other sensitive marine species. I welcome you to review Chapter 3, specifically the affected environment and environmental consequences, Section 3.5 under biological resources. We welcome receiving any comments with respect to particular analyses that could be lacking or any resources that aren't fully accounted for. Thanks.
Thank you. Okay. The next question is, BOEM states this concern about offshore cooling stations. Quote, the number of larval fish and invertebrates lost in the process is difficult to measure, end quote. How many cooling stations are you proposing in this area, and what have you done to alleviate the problem of killing fish larvae?
Yeah, thanks for that comment. And it's good to point out sort of where we're at with our process right now and what we're discussing here today. This is a programmatic draft environmental impact statement that where we're considering the potential interactions with existing marine resources at a high level, the specifications for any substations requiring open loop cooling systems, as the commenter alluded to, would require the intake of ocean water that would be used to cool those systems. And that particular component of the project would be considered in the construction operation plan stage of these projects. Individual project level EISs or environmental impact statements would tier off of this programmatic draft EIS or programmatic EIS eventually. And during the central fish habitat consultations with our partners at NOAA Fisheries. The potential impacts to larval fish and invertebrate entrainment will be evaluated, and efforts to potentially avoid or minimize those interactions would be contemplated at that time.
Thank you. The next question that we have is, how many wind turbines and substations will be installed off our ocean, and how will it affect the radar systems for weather and national security? This is a 2-in-1. Also, how will this affect the thousands of fishermen that work these waters for generations, getting some of the best fresh fish on the East Coast?
Yeah, certainly. Thanks. And again, important to kind of point out where we're at here and what we're discussing. So at this phase of the New York Bight lease development, BOEM is drafting a programmatic EIS to consider the potential interactions with existing marine resources at a high level. Potential data gaps will be identified, and developers will begin to consider plans to address those data gaps to support their construction operations plans. The number of turbines and substations, inter-array cables, and associated infrastructure will be a part of that development, excuse me, of the construction operation plan per lease area. So I recommend taking a look at section 3.6.6 of the draft programmatic EIS, which discusses the potential impacts from offshore wind facilities, specifically on page or in section 3.6.6-18. The U.S. Coast Guard noted in its final area offshore of Massachusetts and Rhode Island port access study that various factors play a role in potential marine radar interference by offshore wind infrastructure, stating that the potential for interference with marine radar is site-specific and depends on many factors, including but not limited to turbine size, the array layout itself, the number of turbines and construction materials, and the vessel types. In the event of radar interference, other navigational tools are available to ship captains. For more information on this topic, recommend that you take a look at the BOEM-sponsored National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine study from 2022. Impacts to weather and national security will also be addressed in a separate response a little later today. Recommend taking a look at section 3.6.1, which addresses the potential impacts to commercial fisheries. Fishing is an important use of the the exclusive economic zone that BOEM must consider in its decision-making process. BOEM regularly engages with commercial and recreational fishermen to understand their concerns from both a biological and socioeconomic impact perspective. Project-specific environmental assessments include an analysis of impacts to fisheries, and every project approved to date has identified fishery compensation programs. The draft programmatic EIS includes proposed mitigation measures to reduce impacts to fisheries that may be adopted for New York Bight projects. Take a look at table G-1, proposed AMMs. And so for mitigation monitoring measures in Appendix G, which includes the commercial fisheries -1 or COMFIS-1, compensation for gear loss and damage, and commercial fish section -6, also in the appendix specific to fisheries compensatory mitigation. These measures reflect BOEM's draft fisheries mitigation guidance developed over the past couple of years, and your comments on these measures in particular are very welcome, and we welcome that feedback specific to this PEIS process. Thanks.
Thank you. Okay, the next question says, speaking as a recreational fisherman and New Jersey-based charter fishing business owner, I support offshore wind development in the New York Bight because it'll provide much needed additional underwater habitat, artificial reefs, for marine life to grow and flourish and help sustain New Jersey's fishermen, both recreational and commercial. I'm hoping that BOEM will consider implementing a, quote, rigs to reefs program similar to the one currently in play in the Gulf of Mexico with its decommissioned oil rigs. It makes zero sense to remove the established reef structure after the 25-year lease period.
Yeah, thanks for your comment. It's pretty forward thinking. I appreciate that. The New York Bight draft programmatic EIS considers eventual decommissioning of the offshore wind infrastructure in section 2.2.1, alternative B, subsection 2.1.2.1.3, conceptual decommissioning. At the end of the project's lifetime, an extensive environmental review process similar to what's partaking today with this environmental impact statement review that will be initiated to contemplate decommissioning applications and to review alternatives to remove these components of offshore wind infrastructure and to avoid, minimize, and mitigate potential environmental impacts. Thank you for your questions.
Yeah, thanks so much, Brandon, for helping us answer those. Now I'm going to turn it over to Megan Cornelissen, who is going to answer the next couple of questions. Megan, if you'd like to introduce yourself to everybody, and then I can read out the next question.
Sure. Hi. So I'm Megan Cornelissen. I'm a social scientist with the Office of Environmental Programs at BOEM. And I think I have a couple questions.
Yes, great. Okay, the first question is inadequate buffer zones around shipwrecks?
Sure. Yeah, thanks for this question. So for this question, I'm actually sharing a response that was provided by marine archaeologists and cultural resource experts at BOEM. So I'll be sharing that response. So in each of the New York Bight leases, there are requirements for the lessees to provide the results of high-resolution remote sensing survey and archaeological assessment of that data with its site assessment plans, or SAPs, and construction and operation plans, or COPs. The lessee also must ensure that the analysis of archaeological survey data collected in support of a plan submittal, again, a SAP or a COP, and the preparation of archaeological reports are conducted by a qualified marine archaeologist as defined by the Secretary of the Interior. Furthermore, the lessee may not knowingly impact a potential archaeological resource without BOEM's prior approval. BOEM has a talented staff of marine archaeologists and other cultural resource professionals that review the data presented in the marine archaeological reports to ensure that the correct avoidance buffers are established around each potential shipwreck prior to approving any seafloor disturbing activities. BOEM consults with many different consulting parties, including but not limited to the applicable state historic preservation officers, state underwater archaeologists, and the U.S. Naval History and Heritage Command, per the procedures established by the National Historic Preservation Act, Section 106 regulations, to ensure that shipwrecks are adequately considered during the construction and operations of offshore wind facilities. BOEM does not prescribe a one-size-fits-all approach when assigning avoidance buffers to potential and/or known archaeological sites, including shipwrecks. Avoidance buffers are designed and placed around known shipwrecks and targets or anomalies identified as a result of the high-resolution remote sensing survey data sets and an archaeological assessment of that data provided to BOEM for a SAP or COP review. These targets can include side scan sonar targets, magnetic anomalies, features identified in the sub-bottom profiler data, and multi-beam echo sounder data, or a combination of these data points. While BOEM utilizes a standard avoidance criterion of 50 meters for some known archaeological sites and shipwrecks, this avoidance criterion is often modified to account for the overall size of a site. For example, if a shipwreck is over 200 feet in length, the avoidance criterion is adjusted to account for the entirety of that shipwreck and its surrounding debris field. Moreover, for unknown sonar targets, magnetic anomalies, or data points identified in a remote sensing survey, BOEM's marine archaeologists analyze the information and make a determination as to the appropriate avoidance buffer for those individual targets. In many cases, BOEM will not simply avoid a sonar target based on the sonar image. Rather, BOEM utilizes a combination of sonar data as well as the overall magnetic signature to determine the appropriate avoidance for that target and ensure the entirety of a potential site is completely covered by an avoidance buffer, accounting for the sonar target and any potential debris field nearby. More often than not, this approach covers a larger swath of seafloor encompassing the sonar target and magnetic anomaly. In many cases, the avoidance buffer can result in well over 100 meters of seafloor surrounding the potential archaeological site or shipwreck. For additional information regarding BOEM's Section 106 consultation process and historic preservation related topics, please refer to BOEM's website regarding historic preservation activities and offshore renewable energy, and BOEM's survey guidelines for providing archaeological and historic property information pursuant to 30 CFR Part 585. And I see we've just put those links into the chat for you. That was a lot. Thanks for hanging in there.
Yeah, thanks for the comprehensive answer, Megan. Great. Okay, the next question is BOEM engaging with Native American tribes that are not federally recognized? New Jersey has no federally recognized tribes. So does this mean that no Native peoples are involved in BOEM's activities in New Jersey?
Thank you. This is an important question. So as a federal agency, BOEM has an obligation to consult on a government-to-government basis with federally recognized tribes, which are recognized by the federal government as sovereign nations. That formal government-to-government consultation obligation only applies to federally recognized tribes, including those who may have ancestral ties to the New Jersey area. However, another avenue through which non-federally recognized tribes can participate is through engagement BOEM is conducting with environmental justice communities and organizations. Since October of 2022, BOEM has been holding quarterly environmental justice forums related to the New York Bight PEIS to hear from community-based organizations who work on environmental justice-related issues in the New York and New Jersey region. Both federally and non-federally recognized tribes, as well as Indigenous serving organizations, are welcome to engage through the environmental justice forums. We'll put a link to more information on the EJ forums in the chat. BOEM has worked hard to reach out to tribes, both recognized and non-recognized, to make sure they're aware of the EJ forums and invite their participation. Specific to New Jersey, in October 2023, we presented at a meeting of the New Jersey Commission on American Indian Affairs to share information about the EJ forums and invite participation by the tribal organizations they work with. However, we're always open to additional recommendations for additional contacts whom we should be reaching out to make sure we're being as inclusive as possible through the EJ forums. So if you do know of an organization you think we should reach out to, please email environmental.justice@boem.gov. That's an email address. We'll put that in the chat as well, and we would love to hear from you. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Megan. Okay, the next few questions are going to be answered by Mark Jensen. So Mark, if you want to introduce yourself, then I can read out the questions.
Hello, yes, my name is Mark Jensen. I'm an economist in BOEM's Economics Division.
Great. The first question we have is, what is the real cost of a windmill from its birth idea to its life end?
Hello, thank you for the question. It can take several $billion to build and operate an offshore wind farm. However, given the differences in project sizes and in the timing of spending, it is typical to estimate these costs relative to the electricity production of a particular wind farm. Levelized cost of energy, or LCOE, is a commonly used measure of the estimated cost of wind farm. If a particular project has won a state solicitation and has finalized a power purchase agreement, one can also assess any publicly available information regarding electricity prices within those contracts. The National Renewable Energy Laboratory publishes an annual market report that summarizes recent data and trends regarding the costs of offshore wind farms, and we can post that report in the chat. Thank you.
Thank you. And yeah, I see that has been added to the chat. The next question is, how much more will New Jersey residents be paying for energy after these projects go online?
Thank you for the question. The effects of an offshore wind farm on retail electricity prices will depend on the differences in wholesale electricity prices for offshore wind and other energy sources. The effects on residential prices also depend on the functioning of the regional electricity market and any applicable state laws. In January 2024, the New Jersey Board of Public Utilities awarded 3.7 gigawatts of offshore wind to two New York Bight lessees, Leading Light Wind and Attentive Energy 2. In a statement, the New Jersey Board of Public Utilities estimated that these two projects combined would increase residential electricity prices by an average of $6.84 per month. And we can put that statement in the chat as well. Thank you.
Thanks, Mark. I think last question for you for now is, you mentioned that BOEM evaluates the economics of offshore wind projects. How are economic determinations made, and what criteria is used to evaluate economic costs considered by BOEM? Where can the public find the BOEM economic evaluation process and criteria for review?
Thank you for the question. The New York Bight PEIS provides some information regarding demographics, employment, and economics in section 3.6.3. The economics of particular projects will be further analyzed in project-specific environmental documents. BOEM's consideration of these impacts will be made public in these environmental documents and in the accompanying record of decisions. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much. Okay, now I'm going to turn it over to Lola. Sorry, I'm going to turn it over to Joanne, who's going to answer the next couple of questions. Joanne, if you want to introduce yourself, that would be great.
Thank you, Hannah. Hello, my name is Joanne Lewis, and I work with BOEM as a navigation analyst in their engineering and technical branch.
Great. So the question we have for you is, how are impacts from ship boat traffic to and from New York Harbor being factored into the leases?
Okay, well, to delineate areas for leasing, BOEM considered information from environmental reviews, consultations, public comments, and coordination with intergovernmental renewable energy task forces, which includes agencies like the Coast Guard. And BOEM must address unique issues and challenges of the area or region of interest, like impacts to ship and boat traffic, in conjunction with changing technologies and industry advancements. BOEM engages with the maritime industry to gain an understanding of the potential concerns from the industry during the planning and analysis phases of the lease development process. And impacts to navigation and vessel traffic are analyzed in section 3.6.6 of the draft programmatic EIS, environmental impact statement. BOEM also requires developers and lessees to submit as part of their individual construction and operations plan, also known as the COP, a navigation safety risk assessment, or NSRA, which will be used to analyze marine vessel traffic impact in the geographic area of the New York Bight lease areas.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for the question.
Yeah, I appreciate your help. Great. The next set of questions is going to be answered by Jade. Jade, if you want to introduce yourself, and then I can read through the questions.
Hi, my name is Jade Haug. I am a geophysicist for BOEM's Engineering and Technical Review Branch.
Our first question is, does the cement have any toxicity for marine mammals or plants?
So typically cement is made from a mixture of materials, primarily containing lime, which is calcium oxide, silica, which is silicon dioxide, and alumina, which is aluminum oxide, that react to harden and bind with an aggregate material such as crushed rocks. The source material for the lime is typically limestone or calcium carbonate. The source material for silica is typically quartz sand, and alumina is bauxite, which is a common sedimentary rock. The chemical reaction that occurs with these materials combined and mixed with water is called hydration, in which materials melt together to form cement or calcium silicate hydrate. Once it's fully cured, it is inert, meaning it is no longer chemically reactive, therefore no toxicity would be expected. So speaking broadly on cement for any purpose, if any of the materials or processing equipment used were somehow contaminated, or if there were problems with some problematic additives, those could leach out of the cement, but the cement itself would be considered non-reactive and should not leach anything.
Great, thank you. The next question is, what steps are being taken to ensure national security, parentheses radar, is not negatively impacted?
So the potential impacts on military and national security radar systems are analyzed in section 3.6.7 of the draft programmatic EIS. Potential impacts under alternative B were found to be minor for most military and national security use and moderate for radar systems. Potential impacts under alternative C were found to be minor for most military and national security uses and radar systems. Radar impacts will be further assessed by lessees in their construction and operations plan and reviewed by BOEM and other agencies in the project-specific NEPA analysis. Furthermore, potential offshore wind radar impacts and mitigations are being analyzed by affected government agencies. BOEM is a member of the Interagency Wind Turbine Radar Interference Mitigation Working Group. It's called WTRIM. One of the WTRIM's primary goals is the development of technology-driven mitigation solutions. A summary of ongoing and planned national security and military use activities are described in section D.2.7 and table D1-14 of the draft programmatic environmental impact statement.
Thanks, Jade. The next question is, what has been looked into the impact of the storm on turbines? What are the EMFs off by cables decommissioning? It's a little choppy.
I'll do my best with this one. Thank you for the question. The New York Bight lease areas are subject to some extreme weather, such as storms and hurricanes, which may impose hydrodynamic load and sediment scouring. The return rate of hurricanes may become more frequent than the historical record, and the future probability of a major hurricane will likely be higher than the historical record of these events due to climate change. The engineering specifications of the wind turbine generators and their ability to sufficiently withstand weather events is independently evaluated by a certified verification agent. So that's actually a third party that's non-governmental that also reviews the design reports. When reviewing the facility design report and the fabrication and installation report according to international standards, which include withstanding hurricane level events. One of these standards calls for the structure to be able to withstand a 50-year return interval event. An additional standard includes withstanding a 3-second gusts of a 500-year return interval event, which would correspond to about a Category 5 hurricane wind speeds. So by the context of your first part of your question, I'm going to provide an answer to whether EMF considerations from cables after a storm may have occurred. In 2019, BOEM published a summary of EMF studies. EMF levels discussed in this report associated with offshore wind energy projects were found to be well below the recommended limits for human exposure. The recommended limits for human exposure are 12 to 100 times higher than the EMF levels from cables measured at the seafloor. The strength of EMF decreases at a rate of the cube distance and has been shown to have a localized effect to the area immediately surrounding the cable. A 2014 study that investigated subsea 35 kilovolt cables off the St. Eanes platform showed the strength of the EMF along the energized cable was relatively stable over time and along its length. The EMF produced by these energized cables diminishes to background levels about 1 meter away from the cable. During construction, to ensure that the cables are appropriately buried, a cable protection system, or CPS, will be implemented to protect the cable from extreme loads where the cable meets the seafloor and is eventually buried to the desired depth. A cable burial risk assessment will determine the cable target burial depth and cable protection requirements for the export cable and intra-array cable routes. To ensure that cables were not exposed after a major storm event, BOEM would also require a monitoring plan be developed for post-storm events. So that's an MUL-16, which would establish how lessees monitor facility infrastructure, foundation scour protection, and cables following storm events. While monitoring would not directly reduce effects on benthic resources, a monitoring plan would provide information about impacts on seabed conditions from storm events. And our sister agency, the Bureau of Safety and Environmental Enforcement, aka BSEE, would retain the ability to require post-storm mitigation to address the environmental impacts caused by the storm event.
Thanks so much, Jade. That's really helpful. The next question we have is, how does the cooling station work to lower the temperature of the energy transfer from AC to DC and vice versa?
So the most common type of cooling system is an open loop cooling system that intakes cool filtered seawater and discharges warmer water back into the ocean. Because of the large amount of heat generated during the conversion of alternating current, or AC, to the direct current, aka DC, at the high voltage DC converter offshore substations located in the wind farm, these systems must be cooled when operating. And the construction and operations plan submitted for the New York Bight lease areas may include the use of HVDC converter offshore substations that would convert AC to DC before transmission to onshore project components. The environmental impacts of discharging warm water back into the ocean is analyzed in the New York Bight PEIS.
Thank you. Okay, I think the last question for you is, who is going to be responsible for flying wind pieces when a hurricane hits the coast?
All right, thank you for that question. There are many considerations in the event that there is marine debris. The PEIS addresses impact-producing factors, including accidental release or spills into receiving waters of a fluid or other substance such as fuel, chemical contaminants, hazardous materials, suspended sediment, invasive species, trash, or debris. Increased accidental releases of trash and debris may occur from vessels, primarily during construction, but also during operations and conceptual decommissioning of planned offshore wind facilities. This is analyzed and considered by BOEM alongside our sister agency, BSEE, the Bureau of Safety and Environmental Enforcement, which oversees the safety and environmental requirements for facility design, fabrication, installation, operation, and decommissioning. BSEE promotes the safety of operations through regulatory requirements and programs such as safety management systems, inspections, incident reporting, and investigations. Projects must be in compliance with both BSEE and BOEM regulations, which require the lessees to design projects that take measures to prevent unauthorized discharge of pollutants, including marine trash and debris, into the offshore environment. Additionally, BOEM would implement conditions for marine debris awareness and elimination that require compliance for recovery and prevention of marine debris and trash in the marine environment.
Great, thanks so much, Jade, for your help today. Okay, the next and I believe last few questions are going to be answered by Stephanie Sharuga. So Stephanie, if you'd like to introduce yourself, I can lead us through these questions.
Hi, everyone. My name is Stephanie Sharuga. I'm an interdisciplinary scientist with BOEM's Office of Environmental Programs. I'm also a member of the project management team for this New York Bight programmatic EIS.
Thanks so much, Stephanie. Okay, the first question we have here is, yes, including, may we please see the questions participants write in the Q&A or chat so we know what is and what is not answered.
So thanks for this question. So simple answer is all of the questions that we have received, both during the registration portion. So if you when you registered, if you submitted questions, as well as any of those that we received during the Q&A prior to the cutoff time that we mentioned in this virtual public meeting, they have all been answered during this Q&A period. So we basically compile them and provide answers to everything.
Thanks for clarifying, Steph. Okay, the next question is, I still don't see the transcript from the January 31st virtual hearing posted publicly.
So with regards to this, we do aim to make transcripts and the meeting recordings available on BOEM's website within 2 weeks is what we aim for following each of the virtual public meetings. With the transcripts, they need to be created from the actual meeting recording, and then everything has to undergo a quality control process to make sure, what's in the transcripts is accurate and, high quality prior to posting of that on the website. So the transcript and the recording from the previous virtual meeting on January 31st will be posted to the website within the next few days.
Thanks, Stephanie. Great. Next question is, why aren't we supplied a copy of the PEIS?
The PIS is available on BOEM's website, and hard copies are available on request. So you have to specifically put in a request for an actual hard copy, but all of the full PIS document and its appendices are located on our website, and we will put the link in the chat for everyone there. So you can access everything through that link.
Great, and yeah, there it is. Awesome. Okay, and I believe we are now up to our last question today. So the question is, can you post the email addresses for presenters in the chat?
So short answer is yes. So the presenters that did the presentation at the beginning of today's meeting were Megan Davidson and Courtney Strain, and we will be posting their contact information in the chat. So you should see their emails pop up in there.
Awesome. Thank you, Stephanie. And that is all of the questions that we've received today. So thank you so much to participants for asking those questions and to BOEM for your thoughtful responses.